I never expected that catching a stranger would change the direction of my entire life. But that's exactly what happened on a cold Saturday morning in October, at the corner of Alder and Southwest Park, between a stall selling honey and one selling handmade candles. She went down quietly. That's the thing people don't understand about someone fainting. It's not dramatic. There's no gasping, no cry for help. 1 second she was standing there with her hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee she hadn't touched, and the next she was falling, and I moved without thinking, dropped the bundle of kale I was holding and caught her before she hit the concrete. She was lighter than I expected. Her coat was the pale green of river moss, and her hair fell across my arm like she had just decided to rest there. I stood there holding a stranger in the middle of the Portland Saturday Farmers Market, and I didn't put her down. Not right away, because for one irrational second I was afraid that if I let go, she would shatter. Let me take you back to the beginning of that morning, because nothing about what happened between us made any sense out of context, and I need you to understand the kind of man I was before she fell into my arms. I was the kind of man who showed up at the market at 5 in the morning to arrange vegetables in a specific order. Tomatoes on the left, in descending size, herbs at the back, labels facing out, squash in the center because the colors were good, deep orange and green, the kind that made people slow down when they walked past. I had been running my father's stall at this market for 3 years, and I had it down to a science, or at least that's what I told myself. The truth was that the routine kept me from thinking too much. My father, George Walsh, had farmed 15 acres outside of Newburgh for 30 years. He sold produce at this exact stall for 20 of those years. When he died, suddenly, at 61, the kind of death that doesn't give you time to prepare, I drove back from Seattle, where I had been working a corporate consulting job I had never really believed in, and I just stayed. I canceled the lease on my apartment. I put my suits in a box. I came to the market the following Saturday because I didn't know what else to do with myself, and the tomatoes needed someone to bring them in. That was 3 years ago. I was 32 now, and my hands were permanently stained with soil, and I had not once regretted coming home. But I had also been alone for every single one of those 3 years, and I had gotten so good at being alone that I had started to mistake it for peace. That was the morning Claire fainted in my arms. She had been standing at the edge of my stall for about 4 minutes before it happened. I noticed her because she was wearing the wrong shoes for the market. Low heels, cream-colored, the kind that weren't made for walking on wet pavement. She was holding her coffee with both hands, and she wasn't looking at anything in particular. Not the produce, not the people around her, not the handwritten signs I spent 45 minutes perfecting every Friday night. She was looking at the middle distance, the way people do when they're somewhere their body is but their mind isn't. I almost asked if she was okay. I thought about it for a full 30 seconds. I'm a fairly private person and I don't go looking for conversations with strangers, but something about the stillness of her felt wrong. Too still, like a tree that stopped moving in a wind that's still blowing. Before I could open my mouth, she swayed, just slightly, and then her knees buckled and she was going down, and I was around the front of the stall faster than I have ever moved in my life. I caught her at the waist. Her coffee hit the ground and splashed across the pavement. A woman nearby made a sharp sound. Someone said, "Call 911" in a voice that was too loud for what the moment actually required. I lowered myself carefully so I was crouched over her, and I said her name, except I didn't know her name then. I said, "Hey," which in retrospect is not the most poetic thing you can say to someone who has just collapsed into your life. Her eyes opened. They were dark brown, almost black, and deeply confused. She looked at me the way you look at something when you're trying to establish whether it's real. "What happened?" she asked. Her voice was lower than I expected, steadier. "You fainted," I said. She blinked twice. "Oh, just that." Like fainting in a stranger's arms at the farmer's market was a mild inconvenience she could file away and deal with later. I helped her sit up slowly and someone handed me a small bottle of water from somewhere in the crowd that had gathered. She took it, drank, and then looked around at the circle of concerned faces with an expression that was half embarrassed and half something else I couldn't read yet. "I'm fine," she said, to everyone and no one. I forgot to eat." She said the last part quietly, like it was a confession rather than an explanation. I want to pause here for a moment, because what I should have done and what I actually did were two very different things. I should have made sure she was stable, handed her over to whatever first responder arrived, gone back behind my stall, and resumed the business of selling tomatoes. That would have been reasonable. That would have been what any sensible person would do. What I actually did was bring her a jar of honey from the stall next door, 2 slices of my neighbor Paula's sourdough bread, and an apple from my own display, and I sat down on the edge of the concrete planter beside her and watched to make sure she ate it. "You don't have to stay," she said. "I know," I said. She looked at me sideways. "Then why are you?" I thought about it for a second. "Because you're still pale," I said, which was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that I was staying because something had happened in the 3 seconds between her falling and her opening her eyes, something I couldn't name yet and wasn't sure I wanted to. Her name was Claire. She told me that when she handed back the empty water bottle, just Claire, no last name, the way you introduce yourself to someone you expect to never see again. She had been in Portland for 2 weeks. She'd come back from New York, she didn't say why, and she'd been staying in an apartment downtown while she figured out what came next. She said figured out what came next the way you say it when you know the answer is probably nothing good. I didn't push. She finished the bread and some of the apple, and her color came back slowly, and after about 20 minutes she stood up carefully and said she was going to be fine. I said okay. She thanked me. She picked up the strap of her bag from the pavement, looked at me once more with those dark eyes, and then she walked away through the market crowd and was gone. And I went back to my stall and straightened the tomatoes that had been knocked out of place, and I told myself the whole thing was over. I told myself that with complete conviction. I was wrong. She came back the following Saturday. I saw her before she saw me, which gave me approximately 4 seconds to decide how to react, and I spent all 4 of them doing absolutely nothing useful. She was wearing different shoes this time. Flat boots, sensible, the kind you actually wear to a market. She had a proper canvas bag over her shoulder, and she walked through the crowd differently than before. Not lost this time, but looking. Specifically, I realized, looking for my stall. When she found it and found me standing behind the table of tomatoes, she gave a small nod, almost formal. "I owe you for the bread," she said. I told her she didn't. She put a $10 bill on my table and picked up a bunch of rosemary and said keep the change before I could argue. I should have let it be a transaction. I didn't. "You can get a lot more than rosemary for $10, I said. She paused, looked up. "What would you recommend?" she asked. And just like that, she was on my side of the stall. What followed was 45 minutes that I have replayed more times than I can count. We talked about tomatoes, specifically about the difference between dry farmed and irrigated, which sounds like the most boring topic in human history, but she was actually curious. She asked real questions. She wanted to know how long a tomato plant lives, how you tell when the soil is wrong, what happens to the ones that don't sell by end of day. I told her I took the unsold produce to a community kitchen on Sunday evenings. She went very quiet at that. "Every week?" she asked. "Every week," I said. She looked out at the market for a moment and then said, almost to herself, "My father would say that's inefficient." I noticed the weight she put on would say, like she was quoting someone she was trying not to think about. I didn't ask. She didn't explain. She bought $50 worth of vegetables she almost certainly didn't know how to cook, and she left, and I watched her go, and this time the feeling in my chest was something I recognized. I just didn't want to admit it yet. She came back the 3rd Saturday, and the 4th. By the 5th, Paula from the bread stall was nudging me with her elbow every time Claire appeared at the end of the row. "She's not here for the tomatoes," Paula said. I told Paula to mind her own business. Paula said my father would be appalled at my social skills. She wasn't wrong. By the 6th Saturday, I had started setting aside herbs for Claire before the market even opened, just in case. I didn't tell anyone I was doing that. It felt too close to hope, and hope was something I had learned to handle carefully. But the thing about Claire was that every time I thought I understood what was happening between us, She would say something that stopped me completely, like the morning she told me she hadn't called her father since arriving in Portland. She said it while she was examining a butternut squash, turning it in her hands like it held an answer. I asked how long it had been. She said 6 weeks. I asked if that was hard. She set the squash down very carefully and said, "It's the only thing I've done in the last year that didn't feel like a mistake." I didn't know how to respond to that. I just handed her a paper bag and started filling it with what I knew she liked. She watched my hands for a moment. Then she said, "How do you know?" I said, "Know what?" She said that I like the heirlooms better than the Romas. I told her I'd been paying attention. She didn't say anything for a long moment, and then, "No one pays attention to me like that." It was barely above a whisper. If the market had been any louder, I wouldn't have heard it. I looked up and met her eyes, and neither of us said anything for several seconds. Just stood there on opposite sides of a table full of vegetables, in the middle of hundreds of people, in a silence that felt very private. That was the moment I knew I was in trouble. I asked her to lunch the following week. It came out wrong. Too abrupt, too fast, like I'd been holding it in and it escaped before I was ready. She blinked. "Like right now?" she asked. I said yes. If she wanted, there was a good place 2 blocks north that did soup and sandwiches. She looked at the market around us. She looked at my stall. She said, "Who watches your tomatoes?" I said Paula would. She said, "Okay." And that was it. That was the whole decision. 2 syllables. I left Paula in charge of the tomatoes. She was insufferably smug about it. And we walked 2 blocks north in the November air and sat across from each other at a small table by the window, and for 2 hours we talked. Not about the market, not about produce. About Seattle. She'd lived there for a year before New York. About running. She ran early in the mornings along the river, and I told her I ran the same stretch sometimes, and we were both surprised, like we'd been occupying the same city without ever crossing paths. About her degree in architecture that she had never actually used because she'd gone straight into her father's company. About my father George and the farm in Newburgh and what it had meant to him and what it meant to me now. She listened the way some people do, with their whole body, leaning forward slightly, not performing attention but actually giving it. When I told her that the farm was what I had left of him, she reached across the table and placed her hand over mine for just a moment, not long, just enough. She pulled it back before it could mean anything more than sympathy. But I felt it for the rest of the afternoon. That evening I drove back to the farm and stood in the middle of my father's field in the dark, which is something I do sometimes when I need to think clearly. The sky was clear and the stars were out, and I stood there thinking about the way she'd said no one pays attention to me like that, and I thought about her coming back every Saturday, and about the hand on mine. And then I thought something that scared me a little. I don't know her last name. 6 weeks. 6 Saturdays. An hour or more of conversation each time. Lunch. And I had never once asked, and she had never once offered. I told myself it didn't matter. It mattered. The following Saturday she arrived later than usual. I saw her across the market, and even from that distance I could tell something was wrong. The way she was walking, contained, careful, like she was managing herself very precisely. She reached my stall and said hello, and I said hello, and then I said, "What happened?" She shook her head. "Nothing." I waited. She reorganized the herbs at the front of my display unnecessarily. She picked up a lemon, put it down, picked it up again. "My father called," she said finally to the lemon. "He found out I'm in Portland." I asked if that was bad. She set the lemon down. "He wants me to come to dinner next week. He has a business contact here. Someone with farmland outside Newburgh. He's been trying to acquire it for a development project." The words hit me like cold water. I looked at her face, she looked at mine, and in the space of about 3 seconds, I watched her realize that I understood exactly what she had just told me. "I need to go," she said. She put $30 on the table and didn't take anything with her, and walked away, and I stood there staring at the money, and my hands had gone completely still. I want to tell you that I stayed calm. I want to tell you that I thought about this rationally. I didn't. I stood at my market stall for the next 2 hours on automatic, talking to customers, making change, handing over paper bags, and my mind was going somewhere very dark and very fast. The land outside Newburgh. A development project. Her father. I knew one name connected to all three of those things. I had known that name for 4 years. Raymond Holt. The man who had sent 3 separate offers to buy my father's farm in the 18 months before my father died. Offers my father had refused every single time. The man who had come to my father's funeral, which I had found so obscene that I'd had to leave the room rather than say something I couldn't take back. The man whose lawyers had contacted me 6 months after I inherited the property with an offer that was generous by any financial standard and completely out of the question by every other one. Raymond Holt, who was apparently the father of the woman who had fainted in my arms 8 weeks ago, who had come back every Saturday since, who had put her hand over mine at a table by the window and listened to me talk about my father like she actually cared. I drove to the farm that night, and I sat in my father's kitchen for a long time without turning on the lights. The dark felt appropriate. I wasn't ready to see clearly yet. I told myself the logical thing. She hadn't known. How could she? I had never told her the name of the farm. I had mentioned Newburgh, but that was all. She came to the market because she came to the market. She talked to me because she talked to me. And she had said, clearly and directly, that she hadn't spoken to her father in 6 weeks. That whatever she was figuring out here in Portland had nothing to do with Raymond Holt's plans. I told myself all of that, and then I thought about the way she had said someone with farmland outside Newburgh. Not a farmer. Farmland. She knew what her father wanted with it. Had she known from the beginning? Had every Saturday been something other than what it looked like? I stopped myself. I stopped because the thought was ugly and unfair and I knew it, and because some part of me didn't want it to be true badly enough to force myself to think straight. She didn't know. She hadn't known until that phone call. I was almost certain of it. Almost. And almost I realized sitting in that dark kitchen was not enough to build anything on. She texted me the next morning. We had exchanged numbers a few weeks earlier, casually, the way you do when someone asks if you have a recipe and you realize it's easier than explaining. She said, "I should have told you my last name." I sat with that message for a long time. Then I wrote back. I figured it out. She didn't reply for an hour. When she finally did, her message was 3 words. "Can I come?" I looked at that for a long time. Not "can I explain," not "can I call you?" Can I come? Like she needed the actual ground between us before any of this could make sense. I wrote back 1 word. Yes. She arrived at 2 in the afternoon. She was wearing jeans and her flat boots and a blue sweater that was too light for the weather, and she stood at the gate of the farm with that particular posture of someone who knows they're somewhere they're not sure they deserve to be. Where her father's lawyers had been calculating, she looked braced for something painful. I opened the gate and let her in without a word. We walked out to the field because I needed to be outside, needed the air, needed the specific clarity of standing in soil my father had turned for 30 years. We walked in silence for a while. The rows around us were spent from the season. Bare canes, dead-topped plants, the beautiful and honest emptiness of a field that had already given everything it had this year. Then she said, "I didn't know he was coming after your land specifically. Not until he called." I looked at the rows ahead of us. "I know," I said. She stopped walking. "You know, just like that?" I stopped too and turned to face her. "You left $30 on my table and didn't take anything. You're not a good liar, Claire." Something moved across her face. Relief, maybe, or grief. "I only found out his target was you when he called yesterday. He doesn't know about the market. He doesn't know I know you." She paused. The wind moved through the bare plants around us and everything was very quiet. For 2 months this has been the only part of my life that felt real. And I wasn't going to give him that. I looked at her for a long moment. "What does that mean?" I asked. She met my eyes. "It means I'm not my father," she said. "It means I came here to figure out who I was when I stopped being his asset. And somewhere in the middle of that She stopped, looked down at the soil between us. When she looked back up, her eyes were completely open, unguarded in a way I had never seen from her before. "I fell for the man who caught me," she said quietly, and I don't know what to do with that. But I'm not going to pretend it isn't true. I need you to understand something about that moment. I had been standing on that land for 3 years telling myself that the quiet was enough, that the routine was enough, that I had inherited something from my father that was bigger than loneliness, and that it would sustain me. And I had believed it, more or less, right up until 8 weeks ago when a woman in the wrong shoes had fallen sideways into my life, and I had caught her, and everything I'd decided to be alone had gotten very complicated. I looked at Claire in the middle of my father's field and I thought about the Saturday she came back for the rosemary. The Saturday she asked how I knew what she liked. The table by the window and her hand on mine. If you have ever loved someone before you were ready to admit it, you know exactly what I was holding in that moment and exactly how afraid I was to set it down. I'm not going to let your father take this land, I said. She nodded. I know. And I'm not going to let it stop what's happening here either. She went very still. I stepped forward. Because what's happening here is real, and I'd rather fight both of those fights than walk away from either one. For a second she didn't move. Then her breath released, long and slow, like she had been holding it for weeks. She reached up and pressed her palm flat against my chest. Not a dramatic gesture, just a real one. Like she was checking that I was solid, that I wouldn't disappear. I've never stood up to him, she said. About anything. You came to Portland, I said. That was something. The corner of her mouth moved. My father is going to be furious. Probably, I agreed. She kept her hand where it was, against my chest, and looked up at me. I think I can do it, she said, quietly, almost to herself. With you. I put my hand over hers, the same way she had done at the restaurant table. Except this time, I didn't let go. What happened over the next 3 months was not simple. Raymond Holt was not the kind of man who walked away from something he wanted. He came to Portland for his dinner, and Claire did not go. She sent him a message instead, calm, specific, and unlike anything she had sent him before. She told him she knew about the land in Newburgh and that she would not support that acquisition or any business that depended on pressuring a grieving son into selling his dead father's farm. He called, she answered and told him the same thing directly. He said she was being emotional. She said she was being clear. He asked if there was a man involved and she said that was none of his business. He said she had disappointed him. She said, Dad, you've been saying that for 29 years, I'm going to need you to be more specific. She told me about that call afterward, sitting in my kitchen with tea she'd made from herbs she had bought at the market over the past 2 months and dried in bundles over her apartment window. She said it quietly, with the careful pride of someone who had just done something they were afraid of. I didn't applaud or make it bigger than it was, I just asked how she felt. She thought about it for a while. Like I finally stopped pretending to be fine, she said. Like someone pulled a stone out of my chest. She looked at her tea. He's going to pull back the money he was going to lend me to set up my practice. I sat down across from her. The architecture practice? She looked at me. I've been thinking about it seriously. There's a studio space on Morrison that's available in January. I kept my expression even. And without his money? She wrapped both hands around the mug. I'll need another way to fund the first year. How much? I asked. She named the number. It was almost exactly what the legal fees had cost my father defending his right to say no to Raymond Holt's first acquisition attempt 4 years ago. I didn't say that out loud. Okay, I said instead. She frowned. Okay, what? Okay, let's figure it out. She stared at me. Caleb, I'm not asking you for money. I know, I said. I'm offering you a partner who knows how to work in the dark when he needs to. Small steps. She kept staring at me. Then her eyes got that bright look again, the one that meant she was trying not to cry and was mostly succeeding. Why? She asked softly. Because you didn't go to your father's dinner, I said, and you didn't have to tell me any of this. And you put your hand on a table and asked how I knew what you liked, and nobody had ever asked me that before. She laughed, one surprised sound that she tried to hold back and couldn't. That's a very strange list of reasons. I'm a very specific person, I said. She reached across the table exactly the way she had at the restaurant, And this time I was ready, and I turned my hand over, and her fingers wrapped around mine, cold again the way they always were. And I held on. Raymond Holt's third acquisition offer for the Newburgh land arrived by certified mail in December. I read it, filed it in the same drawer where I kept the other two, and didn't answer it. His lawyers made contact in January. I passed them to my own lawyer, a quiet woman named Doreen who had handled my father's estate and had the particular gift of making real estate developers feel exactly as interesting as she found them, which was not at all. The acquisition attempt dissolved by February. I never asked Claire to intervene. She offered twice, and I told her twice it wasn't her fight. She argued that it was. I said, "Your fight was the dinner you didn't go to. Let me handle mine." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father has never met someone who didn't want something from him." I said I wanted him to leave my farm alone, which was technically something. She said that was different. I said I knew. She looked at me with an expression I was slowly learning to read. Not the guarded look from the early market Saturdays, not the bright, nearly crying look from the kitchen, but the one in between, the one that was just her, unperformed, looking at me like I was a place she had been trying to find for a long time. "Thank you," she said. "For what specifically?" I asked. "For not needing anything from me," she said, "except me." The studio on Morrison opened in March. It was small, 2 rooms, tall ceilings, a row of south-facing windows that made Claire's architectural plans look like they'd been printed in light. I helped her move in on a Sunday, which meant I rented a van and she directed traffic, which turned out to be the same dynamic as my market stall except with drafting tables instead of tomatoes. Paula came to help and was immediately appalled by Claire's filing system, which was aggressive, territorial, and completely impenetrable to anyone who wasn't Claire. By the end of the day we were eating pizza on the floor between stacks of drawings, and Paula was telling Claire extremely personal stories about my market stall habits that I had not authorized. Claire was laughing at all of them. I sat there listening to that laugh, the real one, the one that didn't hold back, and I thought something that surprised me by how simple it was. This is what I was supposed to have, not the career in Seattle. Not the suited-up version of myself I had spent 4 years constructing before I came home. This. The pizza box on the floor and Paula's stories and Claire's laugh filling up a room full of blank walls that were about to become something beautiful. We had our first real argument in April. It was about the farm, specifically about a minor irrigation repair that was going to cost more than I had in my operating account for the month. Claire offered to help cover it. I said no. She said, "Why?" I said because I could handle it. She said I was being stubborn. I said she was overreaching. We both went quiet in the way that means the argument is actually about something else entirely. She stood in the middle of my kitchen with her arms crossed and her eyes clear, and she said, "I'm not my father, Caleb. I'm not trying to buy my way into your life." That landed hard because it was exactly what I had been afraid of without ever saying it. I put down the invoice I was holding. "I know," I said. She waited. "I've been handling this land alone for 3 years. I know how to do that. I don't know how to let someone else in." She uncrossed her arms, stepped forward. "Then learn," she said, simply, like the answer to 3 years of being alone was just one word and it had been waiting there the whole time. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I held out the invoice. She took it, looked at it, and said, "Okay. We call the irrigation company and tell them we're paying half now and half in 60 days. She said we, not as a slip, not as a strategy, just as a fact, like it had always been the correct word and we had just been slow to find it. I stood there with that word settling in the kitchen around me, and I thought about the first morning she came back to the market, the flat boots, the canvas bag, the intention in her eyes when she finally found my stall. She had been finding her way to this kitchen for months before either of us admitted it. There is a photograph on the wall of my father's kitchen, my kitchen now, that has been there since I was a child. It's nothing dramatic. It's just George Walsh standing in the middle of the field at harvest time, holding a single tomato up to the light, squinting at it like it owes him an answer. My father believed that everything worth having took time to ripen. He said it about the tomatoes. He said it about the land. He said it about people, too, in his quiet way. I've thought about that photograph a lot since, Claire. About what he would have made of a woman in a pale green coat who fainted at the edge of his market stall and then kept coming back. I think he would have recognized it before I did. He was good at recognizing when something was exactly ripe. On a Saturday in June, the first real summer Saturday, the kind where the market smells like cut grass and stone fruit and everything feels like it arrived all at once after months of waiting, Claire was there early. She usually was now, helping me set up before she went to the studio for the afternoon. She was arranging the tomatoes, heirlooms first the way I'd shown her, and she was humming something under her breath without knowing she was doing it. Paula from the bread stall leaned over the divider and said loudly enough for half the row to hear, "You know what? You two have been doing this dance long enough." Claire looked at Paula, I looked at Paula. Paula shrugged with absolute zero remorse. Someone had to say it. Claire turned to me. Her cheeks were pink and she had a smudge of soil on her wrist from the tomatoes and her hair was loose in the way she only let it be when she wasn't trying to be anything for anyone. She looked at me with that expression, the one in between all the others, the one that was just her. "She's not wrong," Claire said quietly. I took the tomato she was holding out of her hand and set it on the table. I looked at her for a long second, all the Saturday mornings between us, all the quiet lunches and the kitchen conversations and the April argument and the invoice and the studio full of light. "No," I said, "she usually isn't." And right there at the edge of the market stall, between the heirlooms and the herbs, I kissed her for the first time. Paula made an embarrassing amount of noise. The couple buying sourdough at the bread stall started clapping. I didn't hear any of it. I was only aware of the warmth of her hand finding mine and holding on, the way it always had. Cold fingers, steady grip, the certainty of someone who had decided to stay. My father used to say that you could tell everything about a piece of land by what it chose to grow, even when you weren't watching. He meant it about the soil, about which wild plants moved in when you left a patch fallow, about the quiet intelligence of a field that knew what it needed. I think about that differently now. I think about the 15 acres outside Newburgh that Raymond Holt wanted to turn into something unrecognizable. I think about a woman who fainted in October and came back in November and kept coming back through the cold and the rain and the arguments and the ordinary goodness of a Saturday morning. I think about a kitchen that used to be silent and now isn't. Claire, she started going by Claire Walsh eventually, a choice she made for herself on a Thursday afternoon with no announcement and no drama, just a name change on the door of the Morrison Street studio. Spends 3 mornings a week at the farm and 4 at the studio, and on Sunday evenings she comes with me when I take the unsold produce to the community kitchen. She said once that watching me do that the first time was the moment she understood who I was. I told her it was just vegetables. She said it was never just vegetables. She's right about most things. I've learned to say that without embarrassing either of us. What I know now is this. Some things arrive in your life quietly, without fanfare, without the dramatic entrance you would have written for them if someone had asked. A woman in the wrong shoes on a cold morning, a paper cup of coffee hitting the ground, 4 seconds of decision between catching someone and letting her fall. And sometimes, if you're paying attention, if you're the kind of person who arranges tomatoes in a specific order and notices which variety she always reaches for first, sometimes that's enough. Enough to start something that lasts longer than you would ever dare to ask for. I never expected that catching a stranger would change everything I thought I knew about the land my father left me. But my father taught me to pay attention to what the earth grows when you give it room. And this, all of this, was always what this land was growing toward.